So I wanted to talk about practice and about how to practice when you have a guitar or an instrument. It's very easy to sit down, especially with a guitar actually, because it's such a cool thing to have knocking around and it's nice just to noodle around on it. But when you're practicing, you set aside time to practice, it's very easy just to sit there and play the same things that you've always played and put that down as practice, and that doesn't allow you to progress. I guess it's the same with anything. There are a couple of ways of getting around this, and it requires discipline. You know, sometimes you don't want to practice. Sometimes you've just spent 9 hours in the office and it's been a dreadful day, and what you really want to do is just sit down with a hot chocolate and watch Cash in the Attic or some other rubbish, and it's easy to do that. But that doesn't allow you to progress. Now, that doesn't mean that if you just sit down in a corner somewhere and noodle around the same old blues scales that you've always played, the same riffs that you've always played, that's not practice, that's noodling. To get around this, goals must be set. And that doesn't sound very rock and roll, but it does help. So if you sit down, I mean, practice doesn't have to be like this appalling sort of Steve Vai regime where you're putting in. Steve Vai used to come home from school on Friday nights at school, this is when he was at school, come home from school on Friday evenings, he'd practice just for an hour or so because he was just obsessive, and then he'd go to bed early on Fridays so he could get up early on Saturday, and between Saturday morning and Monday morning when he goes back to school, get in 30 odd hours of practicing. I mean, the man was an absolute nut job, still is really. Now, that's obsessive. You know, he famously has a 9-hour practice regime that you can find online. You can download it and try it if you really want to, but whew, you know, that takes the fun out of it. I guess that's how you turn into Steve Vai, but it doesn't have to be like that. What I'm saying is that you don't, just sitting down playing the same old notes doesn't get you anywhere, but you don't have to give up the rest of your life to do it. Also, not practicing throughout the week, but just putting in like 4 hours on a Saturday, that doesn't really help either. Yeah, playing for 4 hours on a Saturday is good, but it's much more productive to do half an hour a day, 10 minutes a day, every day. Pop online and find the Segovia practice schedule. Segovia was a famous, wonderful classical player. Practiced on the day he died. Not sure what he was practicing for, but he practiced on the day he died. Maybe he didn't know he was going to die actually, but he set aside time every day to practice, and he wouldn't just sit there and bang away at it. He would choose one thing. Let's choose the major scale again from A, 5th fret, A. He would practice the major scale. Whatever it was he was practicing, but he would do that for 5 minutes, and for that 5 minutes nothing else mattered. Whatever technique he was working on, whatever piece he was working on, for that 5 minutes, just 5 minutes, that's all he would do, and then he would stop, and then he'd look out the window for a minute and watch the birds and see old Jack from down the farm. He'd wave at old Jack, and then he'd go another 5 minutes of whatever technique he was working on, trills, working on hand exercises, whatever it was, he'd work on it for 5 minutes to the exclusion of everything else, and then he would stop, and then he'd stretch his back or whatever he'd do. There comes his dog, he would say hello to his dog, and after a minute or so he would go back again to whatever technique he was practicing, maybe chord shapes. For a dedicated 5 minutes. Then after he'd done that 3 times, 5 minutes, he would get up and he'd have a stretch and he'd look out in the garden and have a bit of fresh air. Just for a few minutes, couple of minutes, and then once he'd had a good stretch, he'd sit down and do another 3 rounds of 5 minutes. And he would do that over the course of an hour. And then just in doing it in these 5-minute bursts, he would be dedicated practice. He wouldn't be playing the same thing over and over again because it was easy to play. He would be doing something that he doesn't understand, hadn't yet mastered, but he'd be doing it absolutely for that 5 minutes, and then he would stop, look outside for a moment, another 5 minutes. It doesn't have to be just hammering away until you're sick to death of the bloody guitar. This is constructive practice. So the first thing is when you're practicing, practice. Get a piece of paper. You always need to have a notepad and pen knocking around in your practice area. Write down something you can't do, that you don't understand, and then read about it and then practice it until you can play it slowly. You can play it slowly, just slowly. And then as you understand it, you can speed up a bit. Now this, again, sorry for the long video, but practice is important. In fact, no, let's stop there. Go and look for the Segovia practice routine and think about how to practice. Practice isn't sitting there noodling the same thing over and over again. Practice is finding something you don't understand or haven't yet mastered and working on that. Go and do that now. We'll talk more about the next thing in a moment.